someone later. And so this other student hasn't been answering my emails, and so I don't know if he's going to join us or not, but I'll record this and then I can send it to him. If he doesn't, we'll have to try to do it separately. So what I wanted to do today was begin talking a little bit about historical thinking, and then do a little bit with some of the beginning material in Presno's book. One of the ways I've done this in the past in the regular class is just kind of brainstorming about what makes a good historical essay or book. So when you're assigned something in a class that you have to read and discuss in class, or write a reaction paper, or write a book review maybe in some classes, what constitutes a good book or an essay? So give me some of your ideas.
How much bias is in their work?
All right.
Or opinions?
Yeah, that's a good thing. There's some material we may talk about later in Presno's book, where she talks about distinguishing between propaganda and scholarship. Propaganda usually doesn't even consider there's another side or things like that. So, and I think I may have talked about this last time we had a meeting, that even if the author, even if his bias tends to agree with your own personal bias on something, you realize that by being too evidently biased, the author hurts their own cause, hurts your cause if you agree with him or her. So nobody wants to read really biased stuff. Sometimes it is a good example, or a friend of mine that I had one class with him, I think, when I was in graduate school, but he was a minister of a very conservative Baptist church in a town nearby, and he was doing a doctorate in education in the School of Education at K-State. Had a program in adult and occupational education, and a lot of ministers took that program just because it was something available locally there, and they could do some kind of study of education in the church or something like that as their dissertation. But he is a very strong Southern apologist for the Civil War. And a year or so ago, he sent me some material, and one of the books, I think it was arguing that the war wasn't about slavery. And I almost decided to throw it away. And then I realized, well, no, this might be good to show students sometime a good example of a very biased book that I tend to think is pretty much wrong. So yeah, the bias, too much bias is definitely a problem. Jordan, do you have any ideas?
How many sources they're citing and what kind of sources they're citing?
Okay, yeah, their use of sources. That's a very important thing. And a lot of students don't pay much attention to that. Now, one of the problems I've always said in a lot of history things is, like in the U.S. survey classes, where I use a reader, or sometimes in other type classes, you might have a collection of essays or something. A lot of the publishers leave the notes out of those things. So the students don't get to see how notes are done, first of all, and don't get to see how scholars use the notes to back up their own argument. So yeah, the fact that the scholar looks at a variety of sources and makes good use of them, also that they are cited properly, that's another good thing. Any other ideas? One is just that it's written clearly. Obviously, you want to be able to read clearly and understand it without too much trouble. I usually tell students in writing a reaction paper, don't get into the style of what you read unless the style becomes a problem. If it's too hard to understand, then you can get into style a little bit. The fact that the book is not as fun to read as the latest novel from your favorite fiction writer is not really something we need to discuss in history. Most of us knew it probably wasn't going to be that fun to read. So also something to look for, especially if you're looking at like a monograph. A monograph is a study on a specific, often fairly narrow topic, in-depth study, not necessarily a textbook, although they are often used as textbooks as kind of supplementary reading maybe in a class. But if you're looking at a monograph, then things like an index and stuff like that are very important. All right, another thing to think about then is how does a student do well in history? Both of you have done well in previous classes of mine. By the way, you were both in North Dakota history, and I'm going to try today or tomorrow to get the annotated bibliographies scanned and sent them back to you so you'll see my comments on them and everything. But if a student came to you and asked, a beginning student, how do I do well in history? What would you tell them?
Keep an open mind.
All right, that's very important. Sometimes people just will not be convinced. You'll see that in reading Horton and Horton's book, where people have presented something, and sometimes there's kind of a mythic understanding that has grown up, and people will not accept anything that's different than that mythic understanding. All right, Veronica, you have any ideas?
Don't rely too heavily upon one source. Make sure you have several different types of sources, whether it's primary.
Yeah, when you're writing a paper, make sure you use a variety of sources. Always, I try to tell students, use the best sources. Unfortunately, even our majors sometimes are content with just throwing a paper together that has a bunch of internet sources. To really do well in most classes. Now, like this past spring, I was a little lighter in grading. I guess the historiography class was the only one that had actual research papers this year. But I was a little more lenient on the use of internet sources. I usually tell students, and this would apply in this class, I think it's in the study or in the guidelines I posted on how to do your research paper. I think I have them on my UJ. If I don't, I'll put them on there. But when I say, avoid heavy use of internet sources, that doesn't include articles that were published in journals. So if you get something out of a database where it did appear in print somewhere, especially if it's in a fairly high quality journal, then that's not an internet source. But I don't want people just looking at websites, except for like if you are doing, Veronica said she's going to do her paper on the Yorktown battlefield. The National Park Service, their websites for each of their military parks are very good with a lot of information. And so that is a good source. But I literally in the past have had students cite a website, and when I looked it up, it was Mrs. Johnson's sixth grade class put together this website. And here's a college student citing it in her paper. Like Dr. Kren used to say, he taught historiography on the graduate level at K-State. I'll send your grade to them, you know. If you're going to trust, you know, maybe they did a lot, you know, maybe especially for sixth grade kids, maybe it was a pretty well done thing. But still, you are not using any critical judgment. I had a incident several years ago in my Religion in America class. I used to have, there were three different research options for that class. You could write a research paper, which of course most people wanted to avoid. You could read three books and write book reviews on them. And the word counts all came out the same for your total. So then you could do three worship service reports where you would visit a church and report on the worship service. Now, the last time I taught that course, I just gave up on that because they have gotten, students would never do the research that they needed to do. And you need to know some background. And another problem today is that a lot of churches are just very similar. You don't see much denominational differences within a lot of Protestant churches anyway. But I had students one year where several of them that had visited a church, they had looked up some, you know, they had actually done some background material. And they cited a source to, you know, like it would be an article on the United Methodist Church at atheist.com. And I told the student, I said, you know, didn't it occur to you that this could be a little bit of a biased source? Although I will admit, I didn't see anything in that source where they took any cheap shots, you know, or showed a overtly biased. It was fairly balanced, but you would think you might want to avoid something like that. Now, how about just in a history class? How do you do well?
Take good notes.
Yeah, in my classes especially. Both of you have probably been in the U.S. surveys where you know you don't have to read that main textbook. If you're there for my lectures and you take good notes, that's what you have to study. The textbook is theoretically, it's to cover things that we don't cover in class because nobody can cover everything. And it's to give you a different perspective if you're really interested in following things up. And it is to kind of provide context. When I skip over something that the textbook can fill in the context. But take good notes and then knowing what to do with those notes. A lot of students, you know, don't really know how to study well. I have noticed this in the past few years. You know, we are so driven by enrollment. We have to have the numbers to have enough money to operate. That years ago, we were taking people with pretty low scores on the ACT and SATs. And that's gotten better. In fact, Dr. Peterson, I've heard her say in a couple of different meetings since she became president, uh, smart but lazy does not work well at Jamestown, at the University of Jamestown. Kids who in high school, they they scored well on their college entrance exams, but their grades weren't all that great in high school. So they're smart, but they didn't do any work. You can get by in a lot of high schools without a great deal of work. But those people don't do well at UJ. You have to be willing to work hard. Obviously, a lot of people get by, but to do well here, you work hard. But I have noticed a lot of times that the students have gotten a little better. Like the reaction papers and stuff I have in classes, or the essays in the Hollitt's book and the U.S. surveys, most people can do them fairly well right from the beginning. They don't have any great problems in writing so that I can understand them, at least. But oftentimes they just don't know how to take tests because they've never really had to study in high school. A lot of high schools give retakes and everything like that. So you don't have to learn to study. I tell students I doubt if very many people ever do this. I think it would be a good idea once a week in a class, type up your notes so that you've got everything in an easy format to follow. And also, as you're going over them, you might think, well, wait a minute, I don't think I really got what the professor was talking about here. Then you could go back to them and talk to him about it. So those are important things. Also, just being there regularly. I give pop quizzes in my classes, which is basically just a way of rewarding people for good attendance, because the quizzes are usually at the end of the hour over what we just did. And sometimes those same questions show up on the exam. And again, it is amazing. You would think it would be easy enough to know, okay, I didn't do well on this, on the quiz, and the professor said it will be on the exam, but often I get exactly the same answer on the exam as what got 6 or 7 points on the quiz instead of 10. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about some stuff in Presnell's book. On the first page in that book, there's a very good comment where she says, everyday history influences our lives. This kind of ties in with the proverb I quoted from a Muslim proverb in our first meeting, that everyone's worried about the future, but it's the past that frightens me. Right now, we're seeing a lot of problems over race relations in our country. Obviously, the past has a great deal to do with that. So history influences our lives every day. Now, she also talks in the first chapter in that book about how history articles or books are written. And this applies to textbooks and monographs and articles in major journals. I think in some ways today, it may be easier to get a book published than it is to get an article in one of the major historical journals like the Journal of American History or the American Historical Review that's published by the American Historical Association. Because those journals, I think I mentioned this before, the idea that history needs critics. Those journals are full of book reviews. About half of each journal, usually, each issue is book reviews. So they can only take maybe 4 or 5 articles per issue. So that's like 16 to 20 a year, or maybe not even that many. Some of them it might be like more like 3 articles within each issue. Whereas if you look at all the books published by the major publishers that do history, there's hundreds and hundreds of books published. But whether it's an article in a journal or a book, Presnell says on page 4, prior to publication, these printed works have been reviewed or refereed by other expert scholars knowledgeable about aspects of the subject. Journals of the major professional organizations like the Journal of American History or the American Historical Review, or the ones that are more specialized like the Western Historical Quarterly, Church History, which is the journal of the American Society of Church History. Those are called refereed journals, meaning when somebody sends an article to them, the editors might make an initial decision. They probably right away decide a certain, probably a fairly big percentage of the ones they're sent. They say, no, thank you for considering us, but we're not interested. But then the ones that they think have some promise, they will send them to what are often called blind referees. And blind means you don't know who wrote the article. They'll send it to you without any name attached to it. This is so that, if you have a particular bias against a scholar, or that this person studied under so-and-so who I have never liked, you can't do that. Now, sometimes, since they try to find people who are very knowledgeable in exactly what the article is about, if it was written by a fairly major scholar, they might recognize right away, or, maybe not be absolutely sure, but say, I have a pretty good idea that so-and-so wrote this. But anyway, you read the article without knowing who wrote it, and then you send back comments to the article, or to the editor, and to the author of the piece. The comments will, if you recommend that the article be published, but you have some ideas for improvement, those will all be sent on back to the author. I have done a few of these over the years for various journals, not any of the real major journals, but like Kansas History, and there's a journal called Fides et Historia, which is Latin for Faith and History, published by the Conference on Faith and History, and I've done blind reviews for them. So the idea is the things that show up in books published by major publishers, especially publishers associated with universities, and the articles that show up in the major historical journals, they have gone through a review process, a vetting process, and that's what makes them very valuable sources. This is one of the problems with websites. Anybody can create a website, or even if they don't have the technical expertise to create it, they can get somebody to set it up for them, and then they can publish anything on it. And nobody is looking at it and saying, no, this shouldn't be there. And so it's very important for historians to develop critical thinking skills about how to see what is a good source and what isn't. Presnell also says, simply put, historians gather clues and evidence from the past in order to understand and reconstruct an image of a particular person, place, event, or time period. I think that's pretty good. Um, Generally, we want to try to tell what really happened, but can we absolutely know? In some cases, no. Um, but we can get close enough. Often, obviously, you can often tell what happened, but the why is the hard thing. We know that Lee ordered Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. We know what happened. We know with fairly good certainty how many casualties the Confederates suffered. But why did he do that? Lee died relatively quickly after the war, within 3 or 4 years, I think, and never wrote anything. And so we don't have any place where he said himself, although he did say, as the men were coming back, he rode out among them and said, "This is my fault. I thought we were invincible." So that's as close as we have to a understanding of what was he thinking? Why did he do it? So the why is often the hard thing. We're somewhat like journalists. You've heard the who, what, when, where, and why. And the who, what, when, where, usually not real big problems, but the why often is. Presnell also says there, historians strive to make meaningful connections between the past and the present. We talked a little bit in that first meeting about we ask questions based on our experience today. Nobody today wants to read an article looking at whether or not slavery was justified. We all know that I don't think there's any way you can show us that it was justified. So this is where that problem of presentism comes in, and why I said that we can't really get completely away from it. We are looking for we're looking for the answer to questions that come out of our own experience. And that means we are going to be somewhat biased to present views and everything. But we do have to make a connection between the past and the present. She also says on page 5, the study of history is not unbiased, despite the best attempts and intentions of historians. History is not merely a collection of facts and dates, but rather the unfolding and telling of a story from the past, which always involves a degree of judgment and interpretation. So the historian's judgment, as we talked about last time, this is why scientific history was not possible. We cannot tell just the facts because there are so many facts. And you have to make a decision, well, which facts are important and which aren't? Well, that's where your own bias comes in. And history today tends to stress interpretation, maybe too much. There's some history that is written pretty well from a kind of technical standpoint. The author draws good conclusions, doesn't seem to misuse evidence, has it all cited properly, has used good sources, but sometimes it's just not stylistically written very well. When I was at K-State, I sat in on a class on American Civil War and Reconstruction taught by Don Neiman. I I didn't take the class, which was a mistake. I should have taken more classes from the people who taught the American general area. But I did set in on his class because I knew he would be one of the examiners. And he used to say in that class that you read authors like Bruce Catton and Shelby Foote, but you don't tell other historians. You read them for your own pleasure. Catton was more of a journalist, but back around the time of the centennial of the American Civil War, he wrote several very good books, and he's a very good writer. And Shelby Foote spent about 10 years writing a 3-volume narrative history of the Civil War. He was primarily a novelist and actually never published very many novels. He's much more known today for that 3-volume history of the Civil War. And again, he's a very good writer. Neither one of them have extensive footnotes. I think in Foote's book there are some notes. But the point is, some scholars, I think, are just kind of jealous that these guys can write so well. So they dismiss them. One of the discussion groups that I'm on email about the history of the Civil War, somebody said, well, I would never accept a research paper that cited Bruce Catton or Shelby Foote. And I thought, yeah, I can tell you haven't taught in 10 years because you'd get down on your knees and thank God if a student actually cited a book, in a research paper. Now, she goes into footnoting a little bit later in that chapter. She says, if you know you are using an idea or words that are not your own, be safe and document your work with a footnote or endnote. The general rule people often give is what is called general knowledge, but that is so vague, it's not terribly helpful. Because more and more today, we just don't have as a society, we do not have a common base of knowledge. Jim Edwards, that used to teach religion here when I first came here, he told me he has had students in religion courses stop and ask him, what's this Easter you mentioned? They had no idea what Easter meant. And I don't think these were foreign students, So what is general knowledge? Well, things that, if you see them commonly written in many books, especially if you see that people write it without any notes, it's probably general knowledge. The Civil War, we generally say it ended the day Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. I think it was April 9, 1865. I won't swear that's the correct exact. Now, technically, of course, there were other armies that did not surrender, including one that didn't surrender until about late June or maybe even early July. But everyone pretty much knew the war was over when Lee surrendered. So you probably don't need to cite that unless you were wanting to make an argument, that, well, we should take more seriously the idea that these other armies didn't surrender. Then you might cite 2 or 3 examples where people have generally accepted that the date of Lee's surrender is the end of the Civil War, and then you kind of make your argument against that interpretation. So what I usually tell students, if err on the side of too many notes rather than too few. You don't want too few notes because then you can get into the problem of plagiarism, even if it's unintentional. Too many notes, professor might reprimand you for it or take a little bit off, but probably not going to be a major problem. She also talks a little bit in there about the problem of internet sources. One is, as I said, that they don't go through any vetting process. And then Wikipedia, now I have read somewhere that they have changed this a little bit, but I'm not really sure. Wikipedia used to be you could just change an article yourself. If you read something and you didn't think it was right, you could make a change to it. Well, obviously, that's a good way for people who have an axe to grind, have a particular bias to get their point in. Another problem about internet sources is permanence. You'll notice that a lot of times when they're teaching about how to cite sources, you're told to list the date that you accessed it. So that says, well, that was here on this date. Whether it is now that you're reading my paper, I can't swear to that. Now, it probably is, but we don't know that, especially if it's just an independent website put together by somebody, you don't know that it might disappear overnight. So she has some good comments on pages 10 to 11 on some of the problems with historic or with online material. The main thing is that you just have to use the same kind of critical judgment that you would use when you're looking at a book or an article. You just cannot assume that, well, it's on the internet. It's, that's the newest, latest thing. So that's where I would find the truth. No, that's not necessarily right. A little bit later in that chapter, around page 12, she talks about the problem of too much material. When you get into a topic and you find there is just more than you can possibly cover, then one thing you can do is thinking about trying to narrow your topic a little more. So that can help you as you start to get into material. The narrower you can come up with your topic to begin with, the easier your research becomes, because then you know that you don't need these things. When I was starting my doctoral dissertation research, I took tons of notes that I never needed, because until I got into it and started sharpening a little more precisely what am I going to do, then you tend to copy down everything because you don't know whether you're going to need it or not. Now on page 13, she talks a little bit about formulating a topic. And this is something that students often have a problem with. Now she says in this book, try to avoid a question as your thesis, but I don't think that's correct. I think a question can make a good thesis. Obviously, though, it cannot be a question that can be answered yes or no. I've written 15 pages on this, and here's my conclusion: yes. It's got to be something that there's a little more complexity to that. She says, keep a strong focus. Too much material covering too many ideas will dilute your argument and your reader's ability to follow it, resulting in jumbled facts and ideas. Sometimes people talk about, people might critique a paper or something, say you chased too many rabbits. In other words, you were on the trail Maybe you were like you had a dog running a deer, and you're wanting to kill a deer, but the dog keeps running off chasing rabbits. So keep your focus narrow. She says, far too often topics are chosen based on the large number of secondary works available. Overabundance of sources can lead to an unfocused project. Quantity and quality are not necessarily equivalent. Now, again, that is important. Like I said, people always ask, well, how many sources do I need? I tell them, you need the best sources. And you've probably heard me say this in other classes, but my dad sometimes, he would give us boys a little fun thing, he called it, a little project he wanted done around the house. And if you didn't get it done, he'd say, I put that tool in your hand and told you to do this. Well, if you come to me and say, I want to do a paper on this, and I say, well, the best source on that is so-and-so's book, then you better have that in your paper. You know, the common excuse is, well, I didn't have time. Yes, you did. You had a whole semester. Interlibrary loan can probably get it to you in 10 days, maybe less than that often. So your failure to use the time properly is not the same as not having enough time. So always make sure you're focusing on the best sources. She also says, on page 13 in her book, she quotes from a guy named Jim Cullen in, I don't know whether it's a book or an essay called Essaying the Past. He says, a good question is answerable in more than one legitimate way. Asking open-ended question allows for multiple interpretations. A good question resonates beyond its immediate subject and invites consideration of broader historical issues. Historical questions connect to other historical questions. The question has context, meaning, and relevancy. This idea of connection is something that's important. I noticed when I first began teaching that often what you do if you're teaching a course like US Survey, the old joke used to be you find the best book, find the best textbook on that subject. You don't give that to the students. You find the next best book and you assign it to the students. The best book you use as your source for your basic outline of your lectures. You're going to take that, you know, you're not going to copy everything the authors say, but you're going to use kind of their chronological framework or whatever, and then you're going to put in your own insights from your own specialty and things like that. But you can go through teaching the first time you teach a course, or first 2 or 3 times maybe, and you get the basic material covered fairly well. But until you've really gone over it several times, you often don't get connections. You don't see that, you know, we talked about this back in week 3 of this class, and that really is important for understanding something we're going to talk about in week 7. So seeing those contexts and those connections are very important. And then another thing she quotes from this guy, Jim Cullen, is a good question opens windows not only about the past, but on the present as well. Now, it says, while you must be cautious about connecting the past to meaningful lessons for the present, there can be a certain universality to questions that remain the same over time, even if the answers may not be. Now that's a lot to take in, but it's something to think about. I talked about the first time we had a Zoom meeting that if you go looking for lessons for today, the danger is you'll find them whether they're there or not. So you have to be careful with that. And then the last point that is made there in her quote from this Jim Cullen is it's a good question is answerable. Obviously, there has to be an answer you can come to. You have to be able to come to a conclusion. It may not be an absolute conclusion. Turner, at the end of his famous essay on the significance of the frontier, he says all of this suggests more study that should be done. He's not saying this is the last thing anybody will ever have to write about this. So that's important to remember. Then on page 14, she quotes a couple other scholars, which suggests some questions that you should ask yourself about your topic. What is this piece about? Now, subject and thesis is often confused, but they're not the same thing. Your subject is, why did Lee order Pickett's charge? It might be your subject. But your thesis is, I believe that I have shown in this paper that his reason for doing that was this. Or maybe you admit we can't be absolutely certain, but I think these 2 or 3 things have to be taken into consideration in answering that question. Why am I writing this? Again, make sure you understand your own approach. If you're just trying to get make a political point or something like that, well, if you're in a seminar or something like that where others are going to critique your work, you may want to avoid getting into extraneous things like that. Who am I writing this for? Who is your audience? Generally, what we tell students, you write for your peers. So in your classes, you are writing for other, primarily history majors, even if it's a class that the other students are not going to get your paper. Now, in a seminar, usually, I think Dr. Weinzierl conducts his seminars the same way. All the students receive everyone's papers, and then the student presides over a defense of their paper. And that means you answer questions about it. Now, in this part of the country, North Dakota nice or Minnesota nice, people often don't go for the jugular. In graduate school at K-State, Dr. Linder thought we didn't have a good discussion unless people were about ready to go outside and start fighting about it. But you do need to be able to critique other people's work, and you need to be able to take criticism from others. That can be very scary if you've never been in that kind of situation before. Now, one thing I would talk about in studying history in general, and maybe about writing, but change and continuity. If you are looking at an era, a particular era in history, and you can answer these 2 questions: why do some things change, and why do some things remain constant? Then I would think that you probably know that era pretty well, if you can accurately answer both those questions. Now, again, some people may have some critiques about what you say, or some additions or something like that. But if you can say, why are they still doing this or still believing this, which people had done or believed 300 years earlier? uh, why have some things remain constant and why did other things change? Um, that is a good point. That reminds me of something I can't remember for sure where she talks about this, or it may be in something that I usually hand out. And if I find it, I'll probably send you some stuff um, as an email attachment. But there was something about trying to find the reason why something happened. Communism collapsed in Eastern Europe because of social, uh, economic, and political tensions developing among the populations of those people, of those nations. Well, that sounds like a pretty good thesis. The only problem is that's the answer to almost everything that ever happened anywhere. That it was because of a combination of social, economic, and political thinking among the people. I have often said something that answers everything maybe doesn't answer anything. One very prominent historian, Richard Hofstadter, he was very influential with the generation before me, the people who taught me in graduate school. He developed a thesis called status anxiety. Why did farmers in the late 1800s become so activist and even radical in politics? Because they were concerned about their status in society. In earlier times, the yeoman farmer had been thought of as kind of a hero. And now, as the big cities grew bigger and professions emerged, lawyers, doctors, college professors, they're the heroes, and the big businessmen are either heroes or villains. The farmer is the hayseed, the hick. So they're concerned about their status. Well, the problem is he uses that to explain two or three things. That's why fundamentalism developed. Ministers were concerned about their status. Well, if the same thing explains several different things, I start to have questions about it. Another thing about something like that is the only way you could prove that is if you can find letters to the editor or diaries or letters between friends where farmers were saying, well, I'm really concerned that we're just not respected as much as we used to. You often can't find the people saying, this is why I did this, or why I got involved in this particular movement or something like that. And that's really the kind of evidence you need in those cases. So, do either of you have any questions about anything we've covered or anything in general about your research or the readings or anything like that?
No, not really.
Okay. I will try in the future to send you some handouts, or what things that I would normally be handing out in class. I'll try to send them to you beforehand. And remember, you may need to print them off because, or I don't know, maybe you guys are sophisticated enough you can look at the Zoom and look at something else on your computer at the same time, but I don't know how to do that. So again, remember, as you are working on your paper ideas, feel free to email me anytime with questions or ideas that I can respond to. Next week, I'm going to be gone. I'm going down to Arkansas to see my oldest brother who's suffering from Alzheimer's. And a few months back, his daughter asked one of the caretakers, she said, how long do you think he's going to live? And of course, they always try to say, oh, well, you never can know. But then she said, well, do you think he'll be alive this time next year? And a nurse said no. So this may be my last visit with, this was my brother that was a Marine officer and was a brigadier general when he retired, was always kind of my hero as I was growing up. So he hasn't got bad enough to where he doesn't recognize people or anything yet. But, and a lot of times, I'm sure you guys have heard about this or had experience maybe in your own family even. The strange thing is people may not remember what he had for breakfast, but you could ask a question about 30 years ago and he might be able to answer that very well. So I won't be available for a meeting, but I will be checking email. So send me your assignments, anything that's due, and any questions and everything, feel free to do that. And I am going to get the stuff that's been submitted so far graded because I finally got the my UJ set up with all of the assignments. So, all right. Well, I think we'll stop for today then, and appreciate you guys getting together with me, and we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks then.
All right.
All right.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye.
Mhm.